Hey, what's up, Silas? Excited to
Hey
talk
man,
to you today.
I'm good. It's good. It's good to chat. We obviously prepped a little bit for this to kind of get this lined up, but it's been a while since we really had a long conversation, so I'm excited.
Yeah, likewise. I'm excited too. We were catching up the other day, just trying to coordinate calendars, and so we could have this conversation. And you reminded me that it's been nearly 5 years now since you decided to skip college, ended up doing Praxis, and I feel like it's been even longer with where you're at in your career today, where you're at with your life. I feel like we catch up every 6 to 12 months, and it's just been awesome to see your trajectory over that time span. So I want to just you start us off, like tell me a little bit more about where you're at in your life career today, and um, let's start there.
Yeah, so I guess just kind of a high level summary. So currently, I'm working with a company called Next Wave Partners. We're a recruitment consultancy that works across clean energy, climate tech, and things like that. I'm a team lead with them. So I started out as an associate consultant. We'll probably get into that in a bit. But yeah, that's where I am. I'm based out of Wausau, Wisconsin. Was originally from northwest of here. Moved to New York for the past 4 years, and actually just like 3 weeks ago moved back to Wisconsin. So kind of a first full circle moment. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. And married pretty recently as well. That's like a big personal item I probably should bring up. Yeah, glad to answer any other particulars, but that's me.
Yeah, how old are you, Silas?
I'm 24, about to turn 25.
You've already had you've had already had an awesome career, for just being still in the early innings, relatively speaking, and um definitely excited to dig into some of those things. But I want to talk, aside from the actual tangible things, your job title, the work you do, I want to hear a little bit more about how you think about your career today and how that's changed over the past 5 years.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the initial thing I kind of look at is if I go back 5 years when I was thinking about doing Praxis, the impetus for doing that in the first place to look at Praxis was I knew that at some point I wanted to build a business, right? I had known this for a long time, kind of since I was pretty young because my dad had a business and I didn't want to take over his business, but I knew I wanted to have a business. So that's part of the reason I did Praxis was I thought, hey, there's so much I have to learn still. I had learned how to do sales by that time. I was doing insurance sales for a year and a half. And this was an opportunity for me to just explore other things. I thought maybe I'd get into marketing. I did that for a little bit during the program with somebody in Walsa. But the thing I was looking at was really I want to build a business and I want to build skills that get me there at some point that kind of de-risk the situation. And I would say broadly speaking, that hasn't changed too much.
Hmm.
The only really big thing is I have a lot more confidence that I can do something, right? There's like very high degree of confidence that I can go out and build something. Whereas before there's a lot of self-doubt as to like, hey, am I capable? I'm from the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. For a lot of people, this may resonate with some people, but when you grow up in like a small town, you don't have a lot of access to network. It's not like your family has a network. You're not coming from a wealthy background. There's no real like chips stacked in your favor per se. And then the idea that like you're going to go work in a big city, like even the idea of moving out of Wisconsin was something that was kind of hard for me to visualize before considering Praxis. Then I was like, well, I want to do Praxis so I can get out of Wisconsin, right? Um, surprise, I'm back here, which everybody said it would be. But we can talk about that later. But the biggest thing was going to New York as no somebody without a college degree, where the company actually relocated me because they're like, hey, this guy, he has the stuff to be successful. I moved out there right before I turned 21, so I wasn't even 21 yet, and that experience of first of all them taking a bet on me and then having like a lot of success throughout the last 5 years, the last 4 years with growing a team and very quickly, I think it was the second fastest to reach team lead in the company's history, and building a lot, making a lot of money for the company, and we can get into that too. But it just really showed me, hey, I am capable now. So I think the way I look forward is more so debating whether or not is it still time to continue learning from other people and getting more
Yeah.
mentorship, or is it time to pull the trigger and go do something on my own? That's kind of the big crux of where I'm at right now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting crossroads to be at. But maybe we'll talk about that in a second. But I want to peel back some of the things you said. So With the level of success you've reached, and you did that in a very quick time frame, especially relative to sort of the typical benchmarks for somebody reaching that same level in your company. What do you attribute most to your success? Is it the environment, you were in the right company? And I don't mean just success within the organization, but I mean success so far in this stage of your career. Is it like getting into the right company? Is the opportunity to work on stuff like cool stuff in the company? Was it mentorship within the company? Was it your own personal professional development outside of your day job? Some level of intentionality building a network? Some other thing? I don't want to just like put words in your mouth and like say, hey, pick from this list, but I want to hear like what allowed you to accelerate that level of success so quickly and at this early in your career.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy to boil down to one thing, but if there is
Yeah.
one thing that I would say is probably the most to blame or to credit is just willingness to work very hard because I'm not the smartest person in the room. I don't think I'm a dumb person, but I'm not like some boy genius or something. So I think it's just that when I started this job, there's partially there may be one other thing too, but this kind of plays into just working hard, which was when I moved to New York, I had like I think I owed my grandma some money because she had lent me money, and I only had like $2,000 or $3,000 in the bank. Right? I had nothing, right? And I don't have a family who can if things go sideways, I can just get bailed out. Like they're not gonna fly me home. There's nobody who could do that for me. Maybe I could have like found somebody because I have enough friends, but like there was no like, oh, worst case scenario, I'll fly back, right? Like it had to work. So when I moved out, I was like dead set on this has to work. I have to succeed. There is no other option. There's no safety net. So because of that, I was like, I have to work hard. And the first year was really, it sounds really like everybody says this, but it actually comes down to just working a lot, right? I would get up, I had a very good routine about making sure that I wasn't pissing around. Like there's no playing around. Like you have a routine that allows you to do your job well, because I know that with any new thing, it takes time to kind of like figure it out. And then eventually you got to like break things loose and get it going well. And that was the circumstance I was going into. I said, I got to work really hard. I'm going to work a lot of hours so that I can learn. And partially that was my mentality, but it was also aided by my boss who was like, listen, there are people who do recruitment for 10 years, but have only 1 year of recruitment experience. And that's because they're not really focused on developing, right? But you can go and do 1 year of recruitment and have, 2 or 3 years of recruitment experience because of the hours you're putting in, right? Kind of that 10,000 hours to learn and become an expert thing. So that's really the mentality I went in with, and that I would say is the biggest driver of the outcome. And you could pair that with I didn't have an option to fail. Like it
Yeah.
was an option.
Yeah. There's something about having your back against the wall that's an incredibly motivating force. As long as you keep that right mindset of like, hey, I'm gonna make it. I'm willing to bet on myself and I'm going to push all my chips in. I'm gonna put in the hard work, which, commend you on having that attitude. It takes a lot of courage and it can be terrifying. But obviously you made it work. You put in the work. Um, what what was the process for you settling on recruitment? I don't mean settling in a bore way here, but like, that was a point of entry for you in your career, and it's something that you've really built something for yourself. Was there ever any anxiety around, hey, I'm going into recruitment. There are 10,000 other things that I might do, and I'm saying no to those opportunities by going in, choosing this point of entry. And how has your thinking evolved about like how you spend your time, the problems that you solve in your career as you've gotten, as you've built more credibility in recruitment? Have you ever thought, hey, maybe there's something else, and this is just where I started? Like, how have you thought about sort of the optionality in your career about, how you focus on, the problems you're solving, how you spend your time?
Yeah, so you might have to remind me of the second part of the question because I usually forget, but I'll answer the first part first. Is the reason so when I chose recruitment, I had another opportunity to move to Atlanta and work as a second employee of an HR tech startup. So it was, actually a startup, kind of venture backed versus a consulting kind of angle. So basically I had these offers at the same time. Compensation was relatively similar, I think. I think that the upside might have been more with the tech startup, assuming things go well in a best case scenario, both situations. But I chose the I chose the option to go to recruitment for, I think, a couple reasons. The one that I really gravitated towards was my understanding of the role was that I would, at the time, it ended up being different, but my understanding of the role was that I would get to work directly with a lot of people who have built a long-term career in something else, right? Finance people or something like that, just kind of in a different angle. And I wouldn't just be some person that they interact with a
Yep.
couple times. I would be a partner to them that helps them build their teams and kind of build some kind of relationship with them. So that was a big one. The other part was I had a little bit of affinity towards New York over Atlanta because I'd never been to Atlanta at the time. I had been to New York. And at the end of the day, I just like, well, this seems like I can do this, right? I trusted that I could to do it, and I thought New York was great, right? I wanted to move to New York. It wasn't specifically because of New York that I chose it, but I think it really came down to I believe that the people I'll get access to in this job will be helpful for something else in the future. Going into the job, my long-term goal at the time, it's different now, but it was to build like an accelerator or a venture studio. That was the objective, but that's why I chose it. The other kind of subcategory was in the process of building a business, you have to do a number of things, right? No matter what business you
Yep.
build, you have to learn how to sell, right? That was the first thing I did. And recruiting people is obviously an important thing, right? So that was like, oh, okay, that's an added benefit. This would be good. The other thing would have been more customer success focused. So it would have been a little different. And I was like, I think the recruitment aspect is going to be good. So I just ended up deciding on that.
Yeah, that's awesome. As you think about where you're at today compared against where you hoped you'd be or where you thought you might
Functionality.
be, 5 years ago, where are you? Are you more successful? Are you less successful? Like, are you proud of where you've been? Like, how was your, how have you stacked up against expectations or hopes you had for yourself when you were, younger and just starting out?
So it depends on where you benchmark it from. I think if you benchmark
Yeah.
it from when I was graduating high school, I was also homeschooled, by the way. If you benchmark it against that, I'm much further than I thought I'd be because I was like, oh, I'm not that much. Like I'm not capable. I'll maybe like build a small construction business or something, right? Like not to say that's wrong, but like I didn't think that I was capable of anything on a more international scale. I didn't have a global worldview. Obviously, the company I work for now is global, so that's nice. That was really really helpful. But if you benchmark it against what I thought I would be when I was moving to New York, I would say I'm probably behind, or close, probably slightly behind because I had this plan that I think we talked about this actually. That kind of after I got started, like figuring out, hey, how can I move towards this long term goal of building an accelerator or an incubator essentially, and you helped me come up with a 5 year plan essentially, and I worked backwards how I could achieve that, and that would be 1 year away from now, and I don't think I'm quite on track to what my plan was. It's relatively close, right? Part of it was building a podcast and getting some credibility, so there's some of those things that are in place, but it's not quite there. The biggest thing the reason I say I'm a little bit behind is these, like the last year and a half, so the first 2.5 to 3-ish years with next way were really like a lot of growth because I learned the job, and as soon as I learned the job, then I learned how to do the business development side of things. That was another big learning. So it was like 6 months, and then a little bit after that, maybe so about a year and some change, and I started hiring my first people. So I hired my first person actually from Praxis as well, and started learning managing. There was a couple other things I learned through that process and some changes that happened, but then it was kind of just upward, right? Like continue learning by managing more people, which is difficult. There's a lot of things that you learn about being a manager once you start actually being a manager. It's nothing like you assume. Uh, then eventually the experience of going into a new market, and there's a lot of things that were just upward, right, for the first 3 years, and my billings kept going up. My first year billings was I think 170 or something. The second year was like 430, and the next year was 560, I think. So it was like that was a really good numbers for a second year employee to do, second year in recruitment to do for something, right? That's like pretty good. So it was always up, and then the last couple of years, like more personal things have happened. I got married, I met my wife to be at some point, and then eventually got married last year. So I wasn't as focused on the career things, but kind of at the end of 2023, as I was reflecting, I was kind of thinking to myself, like career wise, like I think I'm capable of more. And that's the only,
Mhm.
that's like the biggest kind of, I guess you could call it regret I have is like, should I be in some other place where there's more, optionality to apply my skills? Because it's once you learn how to do something and you're very good at it, if you want to continue learning, which is one of my biggest motivators, it's very difficult to just do the same thing over and over again. You kind of get bored, right? So then you start exploring things. You're like, I don't know what should I do here, right? So that's kind of a big point. Was just trying to figure out, hey, what exactly could I have done better to really push myself to the next level? And that's why I'd say I'm a little bit behind.
Yeah, well, I would say behind is a little bit tongue in cheek because you still had remarkable success. But I think one of the misconceptions I had earlier in my career, and I think this is a common feeling, is this idea of success is it's not just that success is linear, but you think about success in the domain that you've chosen to participate in. Call it recruiting for you, or for me it was working in like tech startups, and you kind of plot plot your uh, vision for the future along this one dimension. And I think what ends up happening, you make a good point, is like you start getting really good at one thing. The natural consequence of achieving mastery along one dimension is that you reach a point where at best there's marginal gains, but really the best way to take your game to the next level is not necessarily more depth, it's expanding the breadth of your capability. It's building these additional skills or expanding, you going from an individual contributor to managing people to building teams to learning about other functions of business. I kind of think about it like, Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant later in their careers after they're like remarkable scorers and just phenomenal offensive players, like deciding to focus on the defensive part of their game. Is the natural conclusion of getting really really good in one area is you've got to look to expand your game and move out laterally. And I think that the reason I bring that up is when you think about here's where I want to be in 5 years, you're marking success along this singular dimension, when in fact you're probably farther along, but your ability to create value is much broader than it was. It's
Yeah.
not this one single track. So I'm curious now um, as you think about the goals you set 5 years ago for yourself, how important were those goals in helping guide you towards something, you know, something bigger, towards helping you develop skills? Even if those goals have changed, how important was it to have something that you were shooting for?
I think it's extremely important because it kind of forced me to stay on the edge, right? Like if you just go in and you're focused on only one thing without the next step in mind, in my perspective, you might get really good at something, but you may not even get as good at it as fast because you're not worried about how can I make sure that I'm leveraging this time well to go into the next thing. So I think it was extremely important because I had kind of this broader vision. Yes, it did change, and it changed relatively like it changed like within like a year or so, maybe 6 months after I had set the goals, but I still knew, like broadly speaking, it's the right direction, right? That's what I knew. It wasn't going to be, the nuances would be different, but the direction was correct. So that was, yeah, I would say it was extremely important. I encourage everybody to have those goals because a lot of people I ask in their career, right, what do they want to achieve? They don't know what the end goal is, and if you don't know what the end goal is, which I had to get clear about for myself at some point, then you don't know where to go next because sometimes people are thinking, oh, this is what I want next. But if you're just focused on what you want next, you might be going in the wrong direction because what you think you want next might not actually be in line with what you want to achieve in the long term. And somebody actually, so the other company that I almost worked for, I stayed in touch with the CEO, the founder. And so I'd call him and ask him for like mentorship occasionally. And it was around this time I was planning my 5 year plan that I told you about. He was like, well, why think here's the objective? I got to go A, B, C to get there. What if you can just go A to C straight away? Like, what's the shortest way to get there? And I think that without that end objective, you don't know. So you don't think that way. Your brain doesn't try to solve the problem in another way. If you give it parameters that there has to be 2 steps or 3 steps, your brain will come up with a 2 or 3 step process versus if you just say, hey, how can I do this tomorrow? Or how can I do this as soon as possible? And then your brain will come up with the answers in that way. So yeah, the goal is important, but I think even more important than maybe a 5 year goal is like, what kind of lifestyle do you want to live? This is something I've talked to everybody that I mentor. I try to get them to realize like early on, we have this idea that we're climbing a mountain and we're going to get to the peak and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be sick. We have such a great view, but really it's not, right? Because if you can't plateau, like the feeling of that achievement doesn't last very long at all. I mean, it's usually gone within, for some people it stays around for a while, but for a lot of people it's gone within like a day or a week, right? Even when you like sell a company, you listen to people who've sold their company for millions of dollars. They usually wander, they go through the desert, like kind of metaphorically speaking, wandering, figuring out, what the heck is my life about? Because now I achieved this thing that I thought was going to make me happy, but it doesn't. So I usually tell young people, figure out what things matter to you on an ongoing basis and optimize for enjoying life on a daily basis. Whether that is, whatever it is, doesn't really matter, right? For me, it's family, continued learning, my faith, and building a business. Like I want to have my own business someday, right? So that's like those things are what I have to optimize for. But just mentally accepting that there is no plateau. You're never going to quote unquote achieve happiness. I knew that, but it still was even difficult when I come across the difficult times in life, right? With personal things or whatnot. And you mentioned a few things earlier that I maybe want to go back on, but the general principle is you have to have an objective of your lifestyle that you want to live, that you want to grow towards, because otherwise you're just chasing one mimetic desire after the next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that tends to lead to a one track or one dimensional lifestyle. For me early in my career, I wanted to make a lot of money, but I had a bigger goal in mind for why I wanted to do that. I wanted freedom. I wanted optionality to work on a lot of cool things. But at different points early on in my career, I kind of lost sight of those bigger things because I'm measuring myself across this one metric only. And then it shifted to like, I wanted to climb the ladder. And then it shifted to like, I had to go through a period of unschooling myself as I got earlier in my career, where it was about learning and loving just the process of building and being valuable to other people, where in order for my frame to expand and realize you're playing multiple different games at once. It's not just income status, career success, skill, mastery. It's also the other dimensions of your life. So I think is very wise. I'm jealous that I didn't figure that out. You figured that out so much at younger age, and I wish I would have been ahead of the curve like you. But I want to rewind time and go back to where you were at the start, like very start of your journey. You're finishing up homeschool, graduating high school. You're staring off into the void of possibility. What was your expectation for yourself at that point in time? What were the paths that you saw in front of you? Um, what ideas did you have about the world that were wrong?
So there's a lot there. I mean, I think to just give a quick summary. So I'll try to make it very quick. My upbringing was a little bit rough. And for me, it was about before I graduated, I was just like, I need to get out of this. Like I saw the light at the end of the tunnel is turning 18, so I can have freedom, right? That was basically my objective. I didn't have too many plans beyond that. A number of things happened that before, as I was graduating at that time, I had this. I was very convinced that I was actually going to become a religious. Like I thought I had a religious vocation, so I was super convinced. I had literally started selling or giving away my possessions to my siblings so they could have these things. Thankfully, I didn't give them all the things, but I gave them a lot of things. And then I went for my visit, and I quickly realized like this is not what I was supposed to do. So it's almost like I had a clear path. It was going to be really simple and straightforward. And then within like 2 months of graduating, 2.5, that was completely like taken away and there was nothing, right? It was just a void. So I spent that summer working, 5 part-time jobs. I didn't really know what was next. I was just trying at that time to survive, to make enough money to pay rent and things like that. So I didn't really know. I kind of had in my mind, if I try to think back to that time, I had spent a lot of time talking to my godfather about this because he was kind of my mentor through a lot of this with thinking about business and what I wanted to achieve. But I had really like no true understanding of how these things worked, right? It was just kind of an idea, which is it's good to have that, but you have a lot of learning to do. And eventually, like he kind of helped me get direction by saying, listen, if you want to build a business, you need to learn sales, right? And that's kind of where the trajectory began. That's where I started to feel successful because I never consider myself a salesperson. If anybody who meets me now, they're like, you're the most salesy person you've ever met. Like you could sell water to a fish. Like that people like, yeah, they call me Mr. USA infomercial, right? Like it's what I do now. But at the time, I didn't think I was like, oh, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know. That seems kind of scummy, like selling stuff. Ugh, yeah. But I don't know. Does that answer your question? Like how that's kind of where I was looking. Like, and I didn't have super high expectations. I thought maybe I would go to like community college perhaps and like get a degree in architecture or something so I could go have some credibility to build houses or something. But I didn't have any real long-term goals
Yeah.
aside from, hey, I need to be able to provide for a family at some point. That was about it.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I mean, most of us lack clarity at that age, and it's cool to hear how your perspective has changed. And I'm curious, I'm curious how you thought about college over that transition period of your life. And what was it that led you down a different path?
So growing up, we were never encouraged to go to college. I mean, we come from a very religious family, and it was always like, oh, go to college, it'll take your morals like away. That's what they do, right? It was kind of like that was what we were told. So partially, I didn't really think about it too much. I had considered the most I would have done is go to this community college that's like super cheap where I'm near where I'm from, and I would have just done it for like a certification, right? So I could get something. And the ultimate reason I didn't end up doing that was because at some point, like I said, I live in Wisconsin, so winter comes and you can't do landscaping jobs anymore, right? So you have to do unless you do snow plowing, which I did, by the way. Um, you have to do something else. So that's why my godfather was like, "Hey, what's your plans for the winter? Like, how are you going to make money? Because most of your stuff is outdoors." And he's like, "Why don't you come work with me and doing insurance sales? Right? I'll take a shot on you." Um, so that is basically why I chose not to go to college. I didn't really have any solid plans to do that, by the way, to go to college, but I was like, okay, why not? Like worst case scenario, like because they're gonna give me like a draw, so I can pay for my lifestyle at the beginning, and I'll just figure it out. If it doesn't work, what worst case scenario? 6 months later, I do something else, right?
Yep.
So that's what happened. As soon as I learned that I was capable of selling and I, did really well, I think I was in the top 30% of like 1,400 agents. And when I started selling insurance, I was 18. Um, so when I was like, okay, well, I'm actually like, because there was a benchmark then, like, oh, I'm actually not that bad compared to these like 35-year-olds and 50-year-olds that like supposedly should know more than me, right? Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not that age makes you better or whatever. And then I started to slowly unpack this idea that I am capable, but it took about like a year of doing that when I realized something wasn't right because I had achieved making more money than I ever thought I would. And then that's when I kind of hit this wall mentally. And I went to therapy for about 6 months to really start unpacking like you're not you need to pursue other things, right? It wasn't about just making money. So that's like kind of off the trail, but that's basically why I decided not to was there was another opportunity and I was like, why would I pay to learn when I can get paid to learn?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally makes sense. So talk to me about sort of that next step in your career and education journey, like you finding your way. And part of that, there's a small part of that chapter where Praxis is involved, but talk to me about sort of you finding, the next steps after the insurance sales and,
Yeah.
figuring out the path.
So it was about a year into insurance sales. I started in December of 2017, and it was about a year later. I had that first year, the first full year, I was on track to make I think like 69,000 or 68,000 or something like that for the first year. And like I was like, I mean, living in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, like it's super cheap. That's a lot of money for a 19
Killing
year
it.
old at the
Yeah.
time. I was like, wow, I have so much money. I was balling, right? But I didn't feel happy, right? Because I was like, oh, making money will make me feel happy. That's what I had thought always because we grew up with no money. And then once I realized that that's not true, I was like, okay, well then what is like I have to pursue something, right? And I didn't see a path forward because I was again a circumstance where I learned how to do the thing I was good at. And as soon as I learned, I was like, okay, what's next? The next step would have been you do this for 5 years, maybe 10, depending somewhere in there, and you might get promoted to run an agency. You'll make a shitload of money doing it, but because if you continue doing insurance for a long time, you just build up and you end up making like pretty easily like $1 million a year. But I was like,
Yep.
I just don't want to do this. Like I'm 19, I'm in the prime of learning time. I don't want to stick around. So I didn't know what to do. And I just started talking to people. I've been a very open person my whole life, which I think is a huge like part of why I've been able to get in the right direction without having a network is because I just talk about how I'm thinking or how I'm feeling. Like I can't really think through things. I usually talk them through, which is why I like podcasting. And as I speak about them, I learn, what I'm actually thinking deep down. And people just kind of started pointing me in certain directions. And at one point, uh, Isaac Morehouse's brother-in-law was like, "Hey, you should consider Praxis, this thing." Like, I was like, "Oh, what's that?" Right? And that's kind of where I was like, "Well, you know what the heck, right? Let me like apply to it and see what's up," because I was exploring business ideas. I was like kind of toying around with starting a tea business. I did with my friend, and eventually I got into Praxis, but I was still working in insurance. And like the idea was like, "Oh, you're gonna make X amount of money when you graduate." Most people do. I was like, I'm kind of making more than that right now. I don't know if I want to do that. And so I ended up not accepting to join Praxis right away because I think I got accepted in March or April of 20, let's see, what was this, 2019. And then so I was like, I'll just defer for now. And then ended up about a year and a half mark with the insurance career. Things changed, and essentially my boss was like, "Hey, listen, like I know that this is like we brought you in as you can do whatever business you want, but we need you to perform higher than you want to, right?" Because I was like, 70 grand a year is fine for me, right? They wanted me to pursue like 100 grand a year. So I was like, I don't really want to do this because I was already thinking about quitting. I could just tell my heart wasn't in it. And so I said, sorry, you don't have to give me till Friday. It was a Tuesday. I'll quit, right? I'm out. And then that was kind of the push to say, okay, now that I don't have that, let me go back to Praxis. Like, let me double check. Like, can I get back into this thing? Because I, I'm not constrained by this idea that I'm going to quote unquote make less money. And that was like a kind of a kick in the butt to get me out the door. And yeah, I ended up, so I guess you asked the question about how I kind of led to deciding on Praxis, right?
Yeah, just that overall process of not
Yeah.
just Praxis, but like finding the next step in your career.
So I guess to try to boil it down as best I can, the answer was deep down is, and therapy really helped by going to like figure out what do I want out of life. The only answer I knew, there's so many things I didn't know, but the only thing I could say with certainty was that I want to run a business someday. I want to have my own business. I knew that much. And that was the principle I used. I was testing out things, spending my extra time, like toying around with ideas. Um, and ultimately, when I realized like there's a lot I just don't know of whether or not I could make this work, um, Praxis was a really great way because I kind of just realized, hey, through this, I should be able to find somebody who can help me direct better because the kind of the mentors I have here are a certain genre, and they're not going to probably put me in the way that I want. Um, Again, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't have like some view of taking over the world, but I was like always scheming about, okay, hey, how can I make 10 grand a month doing something that I love, right? And I was listening to Gary Vaynerchuk a lot at the time. I think he's a good person for people at a certain point in their career, but it like kind of gets you moving. But um, anyways, it came down to I didn't know, but I knew I wanted to build a business, and I knew I had to have more skills. So I tried to focus on what I did know and be relatively honest about what I felt comfortable that I could or could not achieve initially. And Praxis seemed like a really good opportunity to go somewhere where it's like, hey, there's basically just opportunity on the other side of this, right? My visualization of Praxis at the time was different than it actually was, but it was like, oh, you're gonna do this, and then they're gonna move you out to some like really like cool startup-y place. You're gonna be working in this open office. It's gonna be awesome. You're gonna be surrounded by tech people. I didn't know really what any of that actually looked like because I had no exposure to it. But I was like, yes, I'm going to do this because it'll hopefully get me out of here and it'll give me just something new, right? I didn't really know what, but I knew it had to be something else. And part of it was just a leap of faith. I had no like solid plan, to be totally frank with you, but I thought, hey, I can do this. And this sometimes like the branding of like if you get accepted to Praxis, you're already good enough. So I was like, this like I got accepted, like must be something, right? Um, so that was like a very kind of wandering period, but it just ended with getting an opportunity where I met somebody through the program who was like, hey, you sound like a sales guy. Do you want a job in New York doing recruitment? And I was like, ooh, sounds cool, right? I'm out of here, right? That was basically what it came down to. And that's kind of what started the process of maybe more strategic thinking.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So I wanna get your take. on a few different things, and we loosely touched on this earlier, but as you think about these different dimensions of your life that you've made progress on, everything from earnings to career success to skill development and learning and your network and your lifestyle outside of your job and the other things that are important to you. There's all these different buckets that you're trying to fill, with the way you spend your time. Talk to me about that journey over the past 5 years. You mentioned, that first job in recruiting, you were working a ton of hours. And so, you probably weren't, your lifestyle was probably mostly just work. But I want to hear more about sort of the intangible parts of just kind of that journey, not just here's what I did for work and here's how I had success for work, but like, what was what's your overall, there's a question in here, I promise, but like, what's your overall level of fulfillment and satisfaction and pride that you have with your journey and like the different steps that you took over the past 5 years, and like, how has that changed over time?
So I would say generally speaking, I'm relatively satisfied because when I didn't mention this before, but when I took this job, it was March 2nd of 2020 that I moved to New York, right? 3 weeks later, the whole world shut down. It was like everybody has their thing about COVID, but that was for me, right? That's what happened. And I knew nobody in the city because my first 3 weeks, I was like, I can't do anything besides work and figure out how to do this job. So I didn't go like hang out with people and make friends. I knew nobody. I knew one person, but he's like relatively older. And he's like, I'm not gonna come out. Like, we don't know what's happening with COVID. And I kind of went through this period of like all I did was work, and then like with any free time I had, I'd watch Netflix or play video games. And I realized pretty quickly, like, yo, this is just unhealthy. So I really started getting into a habit of like getting using habits, right? So having a morning routine and an evening routine every single day. So I had pretty good fulfillment through that process, even though primarily all I was doing was working. Eventually was thinking, hey, what's the next step? You and I talked at some point down that road and come up with this 5 year plan. I knew part of that was the podcast, but the overall fulfillment has been pretty good. I would say that the biggest area that I feel like I haven't added to was personally, I have a large sense of responsibility for when I've committed to somebody or something that I got to stick to it. So when I joined the company, I was a second employee in the US, right? I was helping build out the business in the US. And I had a lot of affinity to them because they were willing to take a chance on a country boy from Wisconsin. So I wasn't just going to loaf around. So in many cases, when I was kind of positioned with the opportunity to spend more time in my extra spare time learning something new or trying out a new skill, like learning how to code something, I chose not to. I chose to put those extra hours in for the company because I genuinely cared about the mission, and it was out of a duty, like out of a sense of duty to the company because they took a chance on me, and I had made a commitment to them that hey, this is going to be my thing for 5 years. I was pretty clear with my boss once I joined that hey, 5 years, and then I want to do something else. So in some ways, I kind of regret that, but at the same time, I also think that there's a lot of goodwill with my boss and the people that I work with because it's very apparent to everybody in this company that I actually care about the success of it. And it has been all the way through our journey. So in some ways, like you could dispute if that was a good decision or not. If I had spent the time differently, I would have tried to spend the time learning new skills because at some point I was like, this is kind of boring. Like I still wish that I knew more about like how to run a funnel or something like that, like some of these more tech oriented things, because at the end of the day, I probably want to build a business in that space. Maybe not a venture backed business per se, but some of those other skill sets that aren't just like soft skills would have been great to learn. And maybe could have done things differently, but eventually I ended up starting doing the podcast, which takes up all of the rest of my spare time essentially, like except for a little bit of personal time. And that's what I committed to, right? Because I know that when you start something, you got to stick with it. And it's paid off a lot with the podcast. But I'd say overall fulfillment is good. How I look at it now is personally, I mean, there's a lot of things I could add about getting married was like a huge, awesome thing for me. Like I always knew I wanted to have family. Family's been important to me. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. So it's been just like part of my who I am is a family person. And that has been very fulfilling. So I feel like I have these buckets all in place now. It's just a matter of maintaining them at this point. So it's like in some ways, I've gotten to my ideal lifestyle, minus the fact that I don't work for myself, right? That's about the only thing that's really missing. um, but I still think it's the same thing. Like I've picked those buckets, the things that I care about, and it wasn't even that I picked them per se. I just acknowledged what they were. I didn't necessarily say, "Oh, I care about these things." It's just deep down, what do I care about? What am I unwilling to compromise and not say like what do I have to do?
Yep.
And I just focus on those things.
Yeah. That's awesome. I'm excited for you, and I'm both proud and like fired up about where you're at today, and like especially having 5 years of conversations and seeing you take that transition. Um, I wanted to really just like one big final question that I had for you as you think about your career journey, all the lessons that you've learned, not just related to how to get a job and how to succeed in your job, but like that last part you're talking about, like filling all those buckets and designing the life that you want across all those areas. What advice would you give to somebody that's 5 years behind you, that's somebody that's at the start of your journey, as you think about all those countless lessons you've learned getting to where you are today? Like what is the message that you wish you would have both been given and listened to when you were, when you were just at the start?
I would say it's probably the first thing is visualize what those buckets are. I'm a person who needs to see things. Like sometimes they just a lot of thoughts come to my mind. They get buried in the back and they sometimes surface with dust on them. But if you can have some method of visually, like you have a whiteboard in your office or something, where you on a regular basis are asking yourself, what are those buckets and reminding yourself of them? Because maybe you think there's something and they slowly change over time, but visualizing what those are and keeping that as essentially the compass, right? Because again, the nuances of your journey and the smaller objectives along the way will change, but that compass should be there. And you have to have, you could call them principles or whatever, but you have to have some kind of guiding thing. Otherwise life is extremely tough to figure out. The the thing that is most difficult for me right now, and I think I've learned this as of reflecting last year, because I do this thing every single year. I spend like 2 weeks just thinking about what I achieved that year. I set out goals for the next year. I put it in a public blog post. I recommend doing that, by the way, because it's been very helpful to specifically take time to step back. If I didn't take that time to step back, I probably wouldn't even be talking to you right now, because I'd just be focused on doing my thing and asking myself, oh, where am I? But that is the first thing, is understanding where you want to go and making sure you visualize it and reflect on it often. And then the hardest part, in my opinion, from the early stage as you develop and go on to the later stages, is learning what to say no to, because initially you should say yes to
Mm.
things and then get into a perspective, right? I mean, I think Isaac says it, if it's not a hell no, it should be a yes early on, and if it's not a hell no later on, it should be, or if it's not a hell yes later on, you shouldn't take it, right?
Yeah.
So that transition, it's not like one day it just flips a switch and you start saying no to things. That is very hard, because the value of compounding your career, like if I just wanted to, I could in one way of life, I could say, oh, I care about my family and these other things. I'm just going to compound doing recruitment of the thing I do and not add anything new, because it'll get easier with relationships and all these things. But I also know that a value of mine is continued learning. So that would be like killing me inside. So it's just a matter of figuring out, as you go along, start figuring out what things you definitely don't care about. Because there's a lot of things I thought I cared about. I'd be presented about an opportunity, and then I realize, I actually don't think that I want that, right? Like there was one particular example where I was like, when I was, it's like a long story, but I basically like did like modeling a bit for this one like menswear store, and I got paid to do it, and it was pretty fun. And there was like a time where I was kind of presented this potential. It wasn't real necessarily, but it was like a potential to have a career in that, in modeling. And I was like, after I thought about it, I really don't want to do that. Like that is
Yeah.
not what I want to do, right? But it was something that before I asked myself the question for real, I didn't think about it, right? I was just like, oh, that's so cool. The people in Hollywood do this stuff, right? Um, so just slowly taking those list of potential interests and getting rid of them to help you focus more, because there's a really great book called Essentialism
Yep.
that if you put if you have 10 hours that you're going to put towards something, if you put 1 hour to 10 things, you achieve very minimal growth in each way. But if you put all 10 hours towards one thing, you're like Mr. Beast and you become the best at something, right? I think Mr. Beast
Yep.
is an incredible example for people of our age, is just putting your focus into one thing and doing it extremely well, because it will pay off, because the number of people who do that is very low. So you quickly differentiate yourself. So that is the biggest piece of advice: is understand the goals, remember them often, and slowly as you're growing in your career, cross off the things that you acknowledge I do not care about.
Fantastic advice. Silas, thanks so much for sharing more about your journey with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. I feel like I'm a little long-winded, but I hope it's valuable.
That's all right. This is super valuable stuff, and it's always a pleasure to catch up.
Thanks, man.